There is a sentence that would have sounded extreme 3 years ago and sounds like practical advice today. Delete Windows. Install Linux. Not as a political statement about open source software, not as a signal of technical sophistication, as a straightforward recommendation to anyone who owns a personal computer and has grown tired of feeling like the operating system they paid for is working against them. This is not a conversion manifesto. It is not written by someone who has spent 20 years on Linux and forgotten what it feels like to be a normal person with normal computing needs and a reasonable amount of patience. It is written by someone who made the switch recently enough to remember every specific fear that preceded it, and who wants to address those fears with the directness they deserve, rather than the enthusiasm that makes skeptical people more skeptical. Let's start with why the sentence "delete Windows" is no longer extreme. Microsoft ended free support for Windows 10 on October 14, 2025. No more security patches, no more updates, no more sysdants for the hundreds of millions of machines still running the operating system that most Windows users had been perfectly happy with for a decade. Microsoft's message to every one of those users was simple. Upgrade to Windows 11 if your hardware quiets. Lifeys, pay for extended security updates if you need more time, or replace your machine entirely. What Microsoft did not say plainly is that a very large proportion of those machines do not qualify for Windows 11 at all. Windows 11 requires a Trusted Platform Module version 2.0, a hardware security chip that was not standard on computers, manufactured before 2018, and in many cases before 2020. Fully functional machines, machines capable of running every piece of modern software their owners need, were told by the hardware requirement that they were no longer good enough for Windows. Many of the people who received that message looked at their options and chose a different one. The numbers that followed are the most significant statistics in personal computing right now. Linux desktop market share reached 4.7% globally in 2025, up from 2.76% in July 2022. Et is more than 70% growth in 3 years. The United States crossed 5% Linux desktop market share for the first time in history in June 2025. India, one of the world's largest computing markets, recorded 16.21% Linux adoption among desktop users. Zorin OS alone reported over 780,000 users switching from Windows following the Windows 10 end-of-support deadline. The Stack Overflow Developer Survey 2025 found that 27.8% of developers use Ubuntu for personal use and 27.7% for professional use. These are not the numbers of a niche operating system for enthusiasts anymore. They are the early numbers of a migration. But market share statistics are not why you should delete Windows. You should delete Windows because of what Windows has been doing to the people using it, and because what Linux offers in response is not a compromise, but a straightforwardly better experience for the majority of computing tasks that the majority of people perform every day. Start with the advertisements. Microsoft has been placing full-screen promotional notifications inside Windows 10, styled in the visual language of system security alerts, to push users toward purchases. A new Copilot Plus hardware. The same design that Windows uses to tell you something is genuinely wrong with your machine was being used to tell you that you should buy a new laptop. The people who received those notifications understood exactly what was happening. The reaction across technology communities was not confusion, but fury, especially thick and justified fury that comes from recognizing that an operating system you paid for has decided your trust is a commercial resource available for extraction. There are no advertisements in Linux. This is not a feature that Linux distributions advertise as a selling point. It is simply what software looks like when the people who built it had no financial incentive to put advertisements in it. Then there is recall. In May 2024, Microsoft announced recall as a flagship feature of their new Copilot Plus hardware tier. The concept was that recall would take a screenshot of your screen every few seconds and use artificial intelligence to index everything you had ever looked at, creating a searchable history of your complete computing life. Microsoft framed this as productivity innovation. Security researchers framed it as something closer to a surveillance apparatus with a user experience wrapper. The screenshot database, stored locally on your device, would be accessible to any malware that gained entry through any of the documented Windows vulnerabilities that Microsoft patches monthly. An attacker who compromised a recall-enabled machine would not just access the current state of that device, they would gain a comprehensive historical record of everything its owner had done since recall started running. Passwords typed into banking sites, confidential documents opened and closed, private messages visible on screen, medical information reviewed on health portals. Microsoft delayed the rollout multiple times. The damage to user trust was not delayed. There is no recall equivalent in Linux because the philosophy that governs Linux development treats the data on your machine as yours, not as a resource, to be indexed and made available to a corporate artificial intelligence system. That sentence is not advocacy. It is a description of how the software was built and who built it and what their incentives were when they built it. Now address the fears, because they are real and they deserve honest answers rather than dismissal. The fear that Linux is too technically difficult is the one that kept the most people away for the longest time, and it is the one that has aged most poorly. Ubuntu installs from a USB drive in roughly the same amount of time and with roughly the same level of technical difficulty as installing Windows. The installer asks you what language you want, what time zone you're in, what you want your username and password to be, and then it installs. GNOME and KDE Plasma, the two most widely used Linux desktop environments in 2026, are visually polished interfaces that any Windows user will recognize the logic of immediately. There is a taskbar, there is an application launcher, there are settings panels organized the way settings panels are organized everywhere. The learning curve that exists is the same learning curve that exists whenever you rearrange your kitchen. Things are not in exactly the same places you are used to finding them, and for the first week, you will occasionally open the wrong drawer. After 2 weeks, you stop noticing. The fear about software is the second most common, and it requires more nuance than a single reassuring sentence. If your computing life is organized around a web browser, a document editor, a video conferencing application, a music streaming service, and a media player, the gap between what Linux offers and what Windows offers is essentially zero. Chrome and Firefox run identically. LibreOffice handles the overwhelming majority of Microsoft Office documents without meaningful issues. Zoom, Slack, Discord, and Spotify all have native Linux clients that are maintained and current. If your computing life includes Adobe Photoshop, Premiere, or Illustrator, the gap is real, and it is not going to close quickly. Adobe's creative applications remain Windows and macOS exclusive, and this is a genuine limitation for creative professionals that should not be minimized. If your workplace runs deep Microsoft infrastructure, including Active Directory and SharePoint-dependent workflows, you are more constrained than a home user. These are honest limitations, not afterthoughts. The fear about gaming has been the most durable and is now the most outdated. ProtonDB data reported by Tom's Hardware in late 2025 indicated that close to 90% of Windows games are compatibility on Linux in some form. Valve's Proton compatibility layer, which translates DirectX calls to the Vulkan graphics API, and matured to the point where the majority of the Steam library works without any configuration. Fornix benchmark testing showed Linux delivering roughly 81 to 83% of Windows gaming performance at 1440p and 4K on NVIDIA RTX 3070 hardware. For single-player games and the majority of multiplayer titles, the experience is functionally equivalent to Windows. The remaining gap sits almost entirely in games using kernel-level anti-cheat systems. Valorant does not run on Linux. Fortnite does not run on Linux. For players whose gaming lives are centered on those specific titles, this is a real and unresolved limitation. For everyone else, the argument that kept Windows dominant among a generation of PC gamers has been systematically dismantled by Valve's investment in the Steam Deck's commercial success. The Steam Deck deserves specific attention in this conversation because it changed something that statistics alone cannot capture. It put a Linux device in the hands of millions of people who had never touched Linux, people who bought it to play games and discovered, without being told to care about the operating system underneath, that it worked, that the games ran, that the interface made sense, that the device did what it was supposed to do. Every Steam Deck owner who had that experience became a piece of evidence against the narrative that Linux is unusable for ordinary people, evidence delivered not through arguments, but through the direct experience of using the thing and finding it good. The practical steps for someone who wants to make the switch are simpler than most guides make them sound. Download Linux Mint or Ubuntu, both of which are specifically designed to be accessible to Windows users and have extensive community support. Write the ISO to a USB drive using a free-to-air, all called Rufus or Berliner Etcher. Boot from the USB drive, which usually requires pressing F12 or delete during startup to access the boot menu. Use the live environment to make sure your Wi-Fi, display, audio, and any peripherals you depend on work correctly before committing to an installation. If they do, install. If something does not work in the live environment, check whether your hardware is on the known compatibility list for that distribution before assuming the problem is permanent. Most hardware issues with Linux in 2026 are solved problems with documented solutions, not novel troubleshooting challenges. The performance argument is worth stating plainly because it is the one that surprises former Windows users most consistently. Benchmarking published in April 2026 documented a 74% RAM gap between Linux and Windows on identical hardware. A fresh Linux installation uses less than a quarter of the RAM that Windows requires before a single application is opened. Boot times on equivalent hardware run approximately 57% faster. A Linux system running for 2 weeks feels the same as a Linux system running on day 1, because there is no background accumulation of processes and telemetry. An update-related overhead that degrades performance over time the way it does on Windows. The machine that felt slow on Windows and prompted thoughts about replacement hardware will, in many cases, feel fast again on Linux without any hardware change at all. The argument for deleting Windows is not that Linux is perfect. It has real limitations, some of which will matter to you specifically, and some of which will not. The argument is that the trade being offered has fundamentally changed. Windows was, for a long time, the rational default because its advantages over the alternatives were concrete, and its disadvantages were tolerable. Advertisements embedded in your operating system. An AI feature designed to screenshot your activity every few seconds and store it in an accessible database. Forced updates that arrive on their own schedule. Or hardware requirements that stranded functional machines to drive purchasing behavior. Subscription pressure applied to software people already paid for. These are not the disadvantages of an operating system that is trying to serve its users. They are the disadvantages of an operating system that has decided its users are a resource. Linux exists as an alternative built on a different premise. The people who maintain it are not calculating how your behavior can be monetized. The software does not have a business model that requires your attention or your data. It updates when you tell it to update. It does not show you advertisements. It does not take screenshots of your screen and index them. For an AI system, it runs faster on the same hardware. It runs longer on the same hardware. And in 2026, for the majority of computing tasks that the majority of people need to perform, it runs everything they need to run. Delete Windows, install Linux. It is, finally, practical advice.